one of the great successes the Ukrainian army had last year was forcing the Russians to fight a very attritional battle for about 5 months on the western bank of the Dnipro, when the Russians were the ones having to be dependent on resupply and rotation across a few bridges and pontoon crossings, and suffered disproportionately as a result. So if the Ukrainians were to push across the Dnipro, they might find it possible to make kind of lodgements, possibly even try and expand those and break out. The attraction of doing it would of course be that not only are there perhaps less dense fortifications than there are in the south and in the east along the Russian lines, but also that if they were able to make a significant lodgement, it would potentially pull Russian reinforcements and reserve forces away from those southern and eastern frontline areas around kind of Zaporizhia and up towards Donetsk.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're joined by Professor Justin Bronk, Senior Research Fellow for Air Power and Technology in the Military Services Team at the Royal United Services Institute. Justin, thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
My pleasure.
I just want to start by asking you about comments from Ukraine's top general, General Zaluzhny, talking really about essentially a stalemate that has broken out in the war. I found that quite striking that he was using that language. What did you make of his analysis?
I mean, it's fairly difficult to argue at this stage that the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which had the major objective of reaching Tokmak in the south, has not achieved its goals. So I think in that sense, it's a public recognition of that from Zaluzhny. And it's also a recognition, I think, of the fact that for both sides, offensive warfare is now extremely difficult to achieve by anything other than sort of grinding massed assaults over time, taking small amounts of territory at once. The reason primarily for that, aside from the fact that neither side can gain or utilize their superiority, so a lot of kind of Western concepts don't really work in terms of the way we would fight. But the main reason is both sides lack the capacity at this stage because of attrition, because of particularly attrition in sort of mid-level officers and therefore staffs for larger formations. They lack the ability to command and kind of marshal forces at a scale much beyond kind of a company at a time. And so what that means is it's very difficult to kind of mass offensive firepower with all the different elements that you need for kind of traditional maneuver warfare, that is, tanks, electronic warfare, artillery, armored personnel carriers, infantry, long-range support of various kinds, enablers, UAVs. Because to do that at a big enough scale, you would need a large staff with orders processes. So I think that is kind of why you've seen very much the advantage on the defending side. And when both sides have been on the offense, not just the Ukrainians this summer, of course, the Russians before that, around Bakhmut, and also recently Russian offensive operations around Vuhledar and Ardvika. The offensive side has not been able to marshal firepower particularly effectively at scale, and therefore have taken disproportionate losses, which is why you've seen this very slow, grinding warfare, very dependent on artillery, and extremely costly on both sides.
But it is interesting that the change in language and the fact that Zaluzhny is willing to use the phrase stalemate. I know previously Ukraine's defense minister had criticised those who had questioned the progress of the counteroffensive, almost suggesting that it was unpatriotic somehow to do so. It was showing a lack of support for Ukraine. Do you think the change in tone from the Ukrainian military leadership is just a recognition of the reality, or do you think it's designed for a Western audience almost?
I mean, it's certainly a recognition of the lack of having made as much progress as they'd like, and having to reckon with that now in the public sphere. Of course, the Ukrainian general staff and armed forces and the political side as well have to both message their internal domestic audience and external supporters. So balancing that tone between those different audience, particularly for something as kind of high profile as a big interview with Zaluzhny, is always going to result in a bit of a tightrope. I think because of the fact that this went out specifically through Western channels, This was more aimed at kind of explaining to Western partner nations' audiences, home audiences, why things have not gone as well as they'd hoped this summer, and also why it's essential for support to continue, but also that there need to be changes in the way that support is delivered and orchestrated.
I want to come on to what Ukraine needs to do to avoid some of the mistakes or problems of last winter in a moment. But just first, Justin, just wanted to ask you about reports, and there are only reports at this stage of armoured vehicles crossing the Dnipro, Ukrainian armoured vehicles crossing the Dnipro. If that is true, how significant would that be?
So ever since Russia blew up the Novokakhovka Dam, there's been speculation around whether there will be renewed fighting across the Dnipro, which is now much, much lower than it was. There's a lot more kind of mud as opposed to water. The thing is, it's an area where Russia is arguably less heavily defensively dug in than elsewhere on the front. But there is a reason for that, which is that while the Ukrainians, or indeed the Russians going the other way, might be able to get a foothold, it will be difficult, albeit maybe not impossible, but certainly difficult, to sustain supply lines and reinforcements and rotate troops in and out of any bridgehead that you would make on the opposite bank by either side. Because at that point, if you make a bridgehead, the other side will know exactly where you have to reinforce and be able to kind of interdict supplies. Remembering that one of the great successes the Ukrainian army had last year was forcing the Russians to fight a very attritional battle for about 5 months on the western bank of the Dnipro, when the Russians were the ones having to be dependent on resupply and rotation across a few bridges and pontoon crossings, and suffered disproportionately as a result. So if the Ukrainians were to push across the Dnipro, they might find it possible to make kind of lodgements, possibly even try and expand those and break out. But they will face a difficult supply route and kind of logistics tail there. The attraction of doing it would of course be that not only are there perhaps less dense fortifications than there are in the south and in the east along the Russian lines, but also that if they were able to make a significant lodgement, it would potentially pull Russian reinforcements and reserve forces away from those southern and eastern frontline areas around kind of Zaporizhia and up towards Donetsk. So, dividing Russian forces may be worth it, but of course it would also be dividing Ukrainian resources. So.
And how likely do you think it is that the Russian military leadership would divert resources up to the Dnipro?
Well, in the event that Ukraine were to establish a significant bridgehead and be potentially looking towards kind of expanding that and moving towards Crimea, the Russian leadership would definitely have to respond to that. They would have to prioritize pushing resources across. But as I say, crossing the river, even in its kind of now post dam burst, kind of semi-dried out state. I mean, it's still very unpleasant ground, I'm sure, and over quite a lot of kind of boggy ground. It will be probably easier for the Russians to move reinforcements to that part of the front than it will be for Ukraine to sustain reinforcements and logistics across the Dnipro basin. But we'll see.
Let's come on to the winter campaign. Obviously, the temperatures massively dropping now in Ukraine. What would you say from Ukraine's perspective that their key objectives are for the next few months?
So they'll essentially, I suspect, have two key objectives in broad terms. The first one will be protecting their infrastructure in terms of trying to protect the power, the electricity and water infrastructure. Russia has been to some degree stockpiling a lot of the production of Shahed 136 or Garan 2, the sort of loitering munition type, one-way attack UAVs, sort of mini propeller-powered cruise missiles, as well as still continuing to produce significant numbers of cruise and ballistic missiles. So it seems fairly likely that they will try and repeat their campaign of last winter to try and knock out a lot of Ukraine's electricity and water. the particular dangers of that being that in the cities, if it gets really cold and the power is knocked out for significant periods, that will threaten the water because the water is electrically pumped. So if you get pipes freezing, it's then very difficult to unfreeze them. So there will be concern there, and a lot of focus on reinforcing missile and air and missile defense systems, especially the kind of lower end systems, shoulder fired man pads and kind of anti-aircraft guns, where possible, because every Shahed that you shoot down, or in some cases cruise missiles that you shoot down with lower end systems, is one that you don't have to waste a much more expensive and more scarce long range missile from an S4, S300 or a Patriot or something like that. So yeah, that will be kind of one of their main priorities, is defending the infrastructure, and secondarily keeping up the pressure on the Russians as best they can, primarily to keep the Russian casualty rate high. As brutal as it sounds, basically one of the key tasks for the Ukrainians is to keep the Russian casualty rate high enough, as it has been for the past year and a bit, that Russian reinforcements, as they are mobilized, conscripted, and kind of trained or semi-trained, have to be pushed into the front line to replace the losses so fast that it stops the Russians being able to build up large-scale forces kind of in the reserve areas and then use those as fresh troops. So the Ukrainians need to keep up the pressure in that sense to avoid Russia building up reserves over the winter. Of course, it helps in that sense that the Russians have been launching attacks themselves at Ardavika and Vuhledar recently in the last few weeks, which and they've taken enormous losses doing that. So yeah, so far Russian casualty rate seems to be staying pretty high, but
Just on that point about the Russian casualties recently in the offensives around places like Avdiivka, as you mentioned, why have they focused so much on somewhere like Avdiivka if they're trying to, in the long term, avoid these casualties?
I'm not sure they are trying to avoid those casualties, but it's probably what Ukraine will be looking at, just in terms of limiting the growth of Russian aggressive capability. But of course, the Russians are trying to regain the initiative and trying to take back ground that they've lost. So they have their own objectives over the winter, which will be keeping the pressure up on the Ukrainians, trying to degrade the infrastructure probably, but also trying to take ground. And they spent a lot of last winter undertaking offensive operations around Bakhmut. So the Russians will have a different set of objectives, although they're of course the other side in the same war.
And on the issue of Ukraine's air defences, obviously they spent much of this year trying to boost their arsenal. How much better prepared is Ukraine this winter compared to last?
Ukraine has a great deal more mobile air defense team capacity, so that those kind of low end air defense teams, not low end in terms of that it's not that they're poorly trained or something. It's that they're using kind of shorter range, cheaper systems, anti-aircraft guns, manpads. They have a lot more of those, and they're a lot better coordinated. It's been an area of continued focus because Russia has relied heavily on the Shahed, and that's been one of the kind of responses from the Ukrainian side. And also they have a reasonable number of much more capable modern Western systems, particularly NASAMS and IRIS-T, which they did, and Patriot, of course, which they didn't have for a lot of last year. They sort of started entering service late last year. So Ukraine's air defense system is in better shape in many ways. One of the keys will be making sure that ammunition supplies continue to be identified and either manufactured or pushed in other ways. There's been a lot of focus on that. In terms of sort of downsides, some of the damage from last year's campaign has not been able to be repaired yet. So, in some ways, the grid itself is starting from a weaker position than last year.
We've spoken a lot on Frontline recently about the ATACMS missiles and Storm Shadow. Would they be used at all in a defensive sense, or would they purely be used to try and offensively attack Russian targets?
Uh, so the thing with Attackums and Storm Shadow or Scalp, um, that sort of deep strike capability is primarily useful as a means of forcing inefficiency in Russian logistics, command and control, um, and kind of the way they station reserve forces and things, because they are by definition expensive and therefore relatively limited in number and ammunition reserve kind of thing systems. So you can't hit everything with them. You can't fight a whole campaign with long range precision strike. It's just too expensive, as the Russians themselves have found, trying to go after Ukrainian fuel, transport, communications, infrastructure. It's very difficult to um, generate and sustain strategic effect with long range precision fires alone. That said, the ability to hold Russian targets at risk significant distances beyond the front lines forces, because they may be hit if there are kind of juicy targets, for want of a better term, whether that be command and control, ammunition dumps, forward airfields, that kind of thing. It forces the Russians, by dint of the fact that the threat is there, to disperse a lot of things and station them further back, which all adds inefficiency and slows things down and essentially makes the Russian forces more fragile. Um, but in terms of any kind of decisive effect, they're really only likely to be able to enable essentially a ground breakthrough. They can't create it. What they can do is make it massively more difficult for the Russians to be in a good position to deal with a large scale breakthrough and to respond to it quickly. And they can, attrit Russian air power on airfields, helicopters, for example, as we saw, and caliber missile shooting capability with some of the ships and submarines that have been hit. But it's not going to. It's not a strategic, just a decisive effect at a strategic level.
And from Russia's point of view, Justin, does Vladimir Putin have the same capability for airstrikes as last year?
Broadly, yes. So Russian long-range aviation, so their bomber force and the MiG-31 fleet that fires the aeroballistic Kinzhal missile is pretty much untouched. They had a couple of aircraft damaged or lost to long-range UAV attacks, but the main fleet is pretty much untouched. They have limited missile production in the sense that they're largely firing the production that they have each month. So they have much smaller stockpiles than they did at the start of the war, but they can keep up the weight of effort that they've been doing, and there's a lot more Shahid available now than there was last year, because as well as the Iranians supplying it, the Russians now have a factory making them themselves at scale. So there's more of that. There is some reduced capacity in the Black Sea Fleet for firing caliber. Particularly, the Russians have had it pretty graphically demonstrated to them a few times that their surface ships are vulnerable. But I mean, frankly, they can fire calibers from Novosibirsk if they want to. Those missiles have long range, and they still have the ability to put submarines, the Kilo class submarines, to fire some calibers, pretty much wherever. Because Ukraine doesn't really have a large, a credible, regular anti-submarine warfare capability in the Black Sea. So yeah, the Russian long-range missile strike capability is largely where it was. There's more ammunition on the UAV side of things, the Shahids, and less on the long-range missile side of things.
And it was interesting recently, your organisation, Justin, RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, released a report suggesting you'd seen satellite imaging of munitions travelling from North Korea to Russia. How significant might they be in the winter campaign?
It is a significant development. Russia had a real shell shortage in the early months of this year. They had fired about 20 million shells last year, and their annual production was somewhere around 1.5 million. They were down to 3 or 4 million in terms of stocks at one point. Their own domestic production has increased really quite significantly this year already. And we've seen more than 1 million shells supplied over the last few months from North Korea. Iran supplying them with shells as well, plus a couple of the countries in the Central Asian region supplying them to some degree, and North Korea also shipping additional howitzers, older pattern towed howitzers, but nonetheless, replacing some of those guns which Ukraine had quite successfully managed to attrit in counter battery fire over the summer. So basically, it is significant. It's not going to suddenly win Russia the war, but it means that where Russian forces had been quite constrained in terms of the weight of fire that they could generate from conventional artillery, relying a lot more on loitering munitions like Lancet 3 for a lot of this summer, that constraint will now be ebbing away as those shells reach the front line, and of course as Russian domestic and international allied production kind of continues to scale up. So yeah, it will make it harder for Ukrainian forces over the winter than it would otherwise have been.
I suppose the flip side is if you're President Zelensky, it boosts your argument that Ukraine needs further military support from the West. What specifically could he really do with right now?
I mean, the biggest thing is just 155mm artillery ammunition and barrels. It's interesting given how much time we spend in the kind of military sciences, military analysis sector, looking at lessons from Ukraine and all of the very innovative stuff that's being done with orbital assets, communications, novel uses of UAVs, novel combinations of all sorts of different capabilities, and ultimately, even despite all of that, the big kind of most significant limiting factor for the Ukrainian forces comes down to howitzer shells and barrels, where I think it's fair to perhaps lay some fairly stark criticism on Western support. I think a lot of what the West has done, particularly the US, the UK, and Germany, and a few others in Europe have done, is broadly very impressive and has actually often been, I think, mischaracterized as deliberately slow, where actually it's just people don't understand the difficulty of what was being put in place. But where I think you can legitimately criticize is European countries, including the UK, have just not made the investments in large-scale munitions production that the US did last year. So US production will start increasing significantly midway through next year. But they have to refill their own stocks, Israeli stocks, South Korean stocks, Taiwanese stocks, as well as supplying Ukraine. So they can't carry the whole thing. And we haven't seen yet that kind of urgent investment in munitions production to make the rate of supply and also resupply our own stockpiles, which we've depleted, sustainable. Which, of course, is a message to the Russians to continue the war. You hear a lot of kind of grumbling in the sidelines these days in political circles of, well, it's all just, everyone's a bit tired of Ukraine and it's all getting very difficult and expensive and maybe they should start to negotiate soon. People I don't think people have realized you can't negotiate your way out of this until Russia decides that its chances of success are better by stopping fighting than by continuing fighting. Every time politicians start talking in Europe or the US about needing to just scale down the supply because it's all too difficult, you are directly incentivizing the Russians to continue fighting because you're telling them that we won't sustain it. So as long as they just keep going, they'll outlast us. This isn't an insurgency where once we decide in the West that we don't really care enough anymore to keep fighting, or it's all just a bit too difficult, we'll accept some compromises, that then the war stops, like Iraq or Afghanistan, as messy as the end of those wars were. This is a case where if we force the Ukrainians to negotiate some form of ceasefire by essentially withholding supply, then all that will happen is the Russians will demand concessions for talks, demand more concessions for a ceasefire, take 3 to 6 months to rejig their forces, get all their supply issues and training issues sorted out, and then come straight back in. Well, they'll be in a much stronger position than they are currently, and the Ukrainians will be in a weaker position. Because on our side, everyone will go, oh, thank goodness that's over, and kind of, lessen off the supplies. So, yeah, unfortunately, there isn't an easy way out of this. We have to convince the Russians that ultimately they will lose more if they keep fighting than if they stop, which currently is not the case.
And why do you think, Justin, the UK hasn't been better at investing in new munitions? I mean, surely in the long term it would be cost effective if it made the end of the war come about more quickly.
It would, and I think it's probably a fair criticism of UK politics that, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, we've lurched from one crisis to another, and there's been very little bandwidth for thought and planning for much beyond the kind of three to 6 month outlook. And this is the sort of decision that requires long-term planning, and modelling of, the civil service in the MOD and other departments will have done a lot of this work. They will have done this analysis, but getting government to look beyond the immediate headlines and priorities is difficult. It also requires cross-governmental work. So, for example, getting the safety cases across in different departments that the MOD doesn't have control over, to, for example, move more explosives around between different factories, ring fencing precursor ingredients, materials, which at the moment are mostly bought up by agricultural fertilizer companies. The price of food has gone up because of the war in Ukraine, so fertilizer is in great demand. Munitions factories with a fixed price contract for shells can't actually necessarily always buy enough precursors to actually make the explosives at a cost that they can then meet the contract at. So it's not that there's no way around that. It's just that it requires government to ring fence a certain amount of, in agricultural terms, tiny, but a certain amount of that market output, and say, no, this is allocated to these companies at this price, like the US Defense Production Act, for example, would do. And that requires kind of significant government attention and planning. And because things have been pretty chaotic for a while, it's also, it is difficult to tell people, especially people who are not looking closely at what's going on in Ukraine, which feels like a long way away, that at a time when public services are creaking at the seams and everybody kind of feels that everything desperately needs investment, which it does, that we should be putting money into shells for Ukraine. What I would say to, sort of try and say as an argument on that is, first of all, this is talking about investing money into production facilities and jobs in UK facilities. This is not giving money away to Ukraine. This is investing money in often quite deprived areas on skilled jobs to expand factories. This would be beneficial for our economy as well. And also, even if we could, if we produced far more than the Ukrainians or us needed, everyone in the world needs 155 shells right now. So you would be selling exports as much as you could produce would be bought for years to come. So it's a fairly obvious economic argument to say that you would get a lot more back than you put in for this kind of investment, as well as it being the right thing to do. But also that, those in defense advocating for, we really need to spend money on munitions and upping production to prevent a war ultimately in Europe beyond Ukraine, and also to keep the Ukrainians going. We would much rather see the money go to schools and hospitals as well. The problem is that ultimately, if a war starts, the global economy will tank immediately. But also, as we see from Ukraine, it would have been comparatively easy and cheap. I'm not saying it would have been easy in absolute terms, but it would have been comparatively so much easier and cheaper to supply the Ukrainians with sufficient material and statements of support to convince the Russians not to invade in the first place than it is now that the war has been going on a while and has started, to actually make them stop. Because once a war starts, everybody doubles down and doubles down and doubles down, because all of that cost, all of that destruction, that loss of life can't have been in vain, kind of thing, for both sides. So deterrence is so much cheaper than actually fighting a war. And with the Russians, with a war economy now, they have transitioned to a war economy. Their production is going to keep increasing over the coming years. The US has its hands full with the Indo-Pacific, increasingly with the Chinese. They're increasingly outmatched in many areas of capability in China. So in the coming years, if there is a concurrent crisis in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe with the Russians against a NATO country, the US may not be able to come and help us at scale. And I don't think people quite understand how vulnerable we would be at that point. It's an old saying, there's no votes in defense. I think that's partly because people don't realize how empty all the cupboards actually are. And if people knew, they would probably be pretty outraged, and there might well be some votes in fixing it.
Justin, fascinating insight and analysis. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
My pleasure.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.